Thank you. Yeah, so basically, the hope is that by the end of this, you'll have a good idea of if this is something you want to do with your project, how you might go about setting stuff up for that. But let me not get too far ahead of myself. I'm Derrick Taylor. I go by Galdoc on Discord and various other places. Um, and so to start off with, let's just sort of identify the problem. Making 2D game assets with the traditional techniques, which is amazing because, I usually think of traditional things in the art space as being like traditional pen and paper or watercolors or something like that. But in this particular instance, I mean using a drawing tablet of some sort, whether that's a display tablet or just a Intuos Wacom or whatever you have. You can do that, but the problem is that it doesn't scale well. That is to say, if you have to make a whole bunch of assets, fleshing out a huge monster roster or doing a ton of animations, again, you get that really nice hand painted look, but it does take a lot of time, and there might be alternatives available if what you're working with, excuse me, would do well in that sort of domain. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Um, Rendering 3D scenes down to 2D images involves non-obvious stylistic implications. So basically, a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is how to use a 3D source, essentially the 3D underlying truth, if you will, for these assets. And we're going to be talking about turning that into something 2D that isn't necessarily rendered live. That is an option. You can do that, like at runtime, but it is hard. Maybe that's worth it to you if you have enough knowledge of shaders or if you can work out the problems that aren't necessarily on the surface. Then sure, that could be a very good option actually. But it might not necessarily make the most sense because, I mean, honestly, there are some things in the zeitgeist of sprite design. There are things that we kind of come to expect. Sometimes that might look like a frame rate, for example, in like Doom. You might, if certain things are too smooth, people start complaining. I can tell you that from experience. But there are various things that it might make more sense to bake these things into 2D images and then use those for your assets. Mixing traditional pixels art and 3D to 2D assets stylistically is hard. If these two things, your 3D assets and the 2D hand painted assets, disagree too much. So that's something that can happen when you have some things that you've painted, maybe they're icons, but then the characters are in 3D pixel art and they don't necessarily jive. It's not always a problem, but it is something to keep in mind. And lastly, there are resources out there for this, and they're great, but they do seem a bit scattered. A lot of the focus tends to, from what I've seen at least, be on like the AAA game design stuff, which is fine. Don't get me wrong. But there's also like pixel art things out there, but there's not a whole lot of 3D to 2D pixel art stuff out there. That being said, I'll be pointing out some resources and sort of pointing you in those directions so that if this is something that interests you, you can go out and do it. We'll be talking about developing styles and workflows. We aren't going to be developing a style per se here, but like just things to consider when you're doing that. I'll be giving you a bunch of names of software, some free, some not, and some perspectives that can help scale up production. Scaling is a big thing we're going to be talking about here. And we'll be seeing an example of how to do this in Blender. And on that note, a show of hands or hand emojis. Who here has used Blender before? I ask mainly because when I start getting in on Blender, I don't necessarily want it to be the guy who solves the Rubik's Cube super fast. And then how did he do that? So I'm using the Talks chat channel. So if you click on the little open chat icon, if you care to share, by all means, let me know if you've used Blender before, but I'm by and large going to be taking this from a no one's used it ever before, and we'll sort of be building from the ground up. We aren't going to be going so deep into it that it's going to serve as a Blender tutorial, but the idea is mostly that if this is something you want to do, you can sort of get a sense of what would be involved. One point of clarification, though, this isn't about baking high detail UV map data for use in the lower poly 3D models for games. That is a cool thing, but that is a bit different. However, we will be talking about something a little bit similar near the end of the talk. So, uh, yeah. Who is this guy? My background is in physics, math, and education. I taught high school for many years. I have 2 education-focused YouTube channels. In game dev, my experience is mostly in mods and personal projects. Notably, I worked on Project Brutality, a 1993 Doom mod, as a weapons animator. And most recently, I've been working on Galdox Manufacturing, which is a mod for Factorio. I'm the lead quote unquote dev. I don't want to say I'm solo because that would diminish the help that people have offered, but by and large, I'm the one who's doing most of the heavy lifting. So, yeah. My relevant skills include photography, motion graphics, animation, 2D design, both raster and vector, and 3D design and all the things that come with it. Rigging and UV maps, texture painting, sculpting, all this good stuff. Irrelevant skills. I can read the entire back of a cereal box before finishing a bowl, which is a lie. If there's a maze on it, I am totally doomed. Anyhow, so here is a list of some tools that I personally have found very valuable. We'll start with the free ones. Blender, which is an amazing piece of software. It's great that we get to live in the universe where Blender is free, and it blows my mind. PureRef, this is something that I'll talk a little bit more about later, but it's essentially something to help organize assets for concept art and stuff like that. Advanced Renamer. This is a program that I use all the time whenever I'm doing sort of batch processes, and it gets to be a bit dicey inside the program in order to rename these things. Advanced Renamer just comes in clutch when you have to change a whole bunch of file names and give them any kind of ordering. I'll talk a little bit about that, but I cannot recommend this highly enough. Every person who I know who I've told, hey, look, go get Advanced Renamer to, they've all said they love it and they don't know how they live without it. Krita. I love Krita. I'm not very familiar with it. I'm not so much of a 2D artist myself when it comes to like traditional quote unquote styles. But it is something that is free. It is amazing too. And again, glad I get to live in the world where this exists. I do not know how to pronounce this. Lagter, something. Anyways, the point is this is a piece of software that is very good for taking 2D things like 2D textures or whatever, and turning them into something that has a sort of PBR-based workflow with normal maps and roughness maps and all that stuff. I'll give you a little sample of this at the end. And here are some icons. So this is the Lecter, this is the Krita, this is PureRef, this is Blender, and Advanced Renamer doesn't really have an icon, so whatever. The ones that are not free, Sprite Handler is a Blender add-on that I use. It costs $10. You don't have to get this. There are other sprite sheet maker things out there. I personally like this one. It fits with my workflow well. It costs $10. But I do need to caution anyone who is dealing with add-ons for Blender. Blender itself goes into what's called long-term support periodically. So essentially it gives, I think at this point, we're doing 3 major updates per year. And long-term support means that if you have a problem, you can get some kind of help with it. It's not going to be like the people who design it, but the community is out there. And if there is a bug or something, then the team does sort of handle that. Sprite Handler being an add-on, these tend to go they don't really have a long-term support. So if something breaks, there's no guarantee that it'll be updated. That being said, it's been working fine for me. And, at least as of right now, it's just, along with all the add-ons I'm mentioning here, it's just fine. Render Set is a $60-ish Blender add-on, and this one is a bit pricey. There is a cheaper personal use one. I'm listing off the $59. Let me alt tab over to here. I have it brought up. You can get it for $30, but the thing is that this is for non-commercial use. That being said, if what you're doing is you're an indie dev, you haven't yet published, maybe you use personal and then go to pro. I don't know how this works. Generally speaking, the people like I've talked to the people who make at Polygonique who make this, they seem like chill people. So I definitely would get this if you're going to publish anything professionally, just because you need a commercial you need a commercial license. But yeah, I'll be showcasing this later though. It is absolutely amazing, and I kind of wish it was baked into Blender itself. I hope that there's in the future something they make for it. Pixel Composer, I will be showing this near the end. I am not an expert at Pixel Composer, but I want to be. I love this little program. But let me not get ahead of myself. Just costs $10. The dev worked on it monastically, just constant updates. Really, really awesome. And of course, there's the Photoshop / Affinity Photo, which might surprise you being on this list here because I've sort of been talking about going from 3D to 2D and the pipelines involved there. And these are not 3D programs. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but suffice to say that automation is a very, very important component of all of these workflows. And you are going to need, no matter what, because you're dealing in the 2D space. Hold on one second. Oh, okay. Say hi. Yeah.
Hello. Hello.
Okay, that's my kids. Like I said, non-zero chance they would show up. Okay, can you close the door? I love you both. Oh my gosh, can you bring me a cookie? Okay, okay. I gotta get back to talk though. No, please. No. Okay, sorry. All right, so you're going to need something that can do automated processing of 2D assets here. Hold on one second. Okay, so let's see. This is the icon for Pixel Composer. Absolutely love this thing. Okay, so okay, thank you. Okay, now I really gotta get back to work. So for art style, I personally don't know exactly how to tell you what to do here, specifically because there are so many different styles out there. Hold on for one second. Sorry. Let's see. Drawing inspiration from other extant styles is completely valid. The problem is that whatever project you have in your mind is going to be whatever you're sort of working towards. I can tell you what I've done as an example for Factorio, but I can't quite tell you what you're going to want to work on. There are some things to consider though, and we're going to start off with some examples. Donkey Kong Country, Dead Cells, Factorio, and even Castlevania Symphony of the Night. So Donkey Kong Country was one where they essentially baked 3D to 2D assets. They basically baked these things here. And this was, I don't know how many of you have played this game, but back in the day, this was like, whoa, this is amazing. I have to be a little careful here. You can see that it's very JPEG artifacty almost, but it's not quite that. This is this might even be a CRT render. I'm not actually sure. But basically, you can see that there are some inconsistencies here, like the light's coming straight down on this. I don't know if the light's coming straight down on this. I think it's coming in from the side. There's sort of a more even lighting that's lighting this rock and this rock than are the icons around here. And partially that's just because these icons here were baked with a particular lighting, which doesn't necessarily agree with the rest of it. But none of this is true 3D in the sense that when the game is actually rendering this, these are actual sprites. This is a style. I don't know if this is the style you would personally want to go for. I don't quite want to say this is a stepping stone style, as in, we've kind of moved on from this, but that's partially just because I sort of live in a pixel world, and so I don't necessarily want to say anything is a stepping stone style. If this is what speaks to you, then make this. But it is one thing you can do where you just literally bake out these 3D objects like so. Castlevania Symphony of the Night. It might surprise you to find out this was actually a 3D game. It's just that it basically put sprites on the screen in the same way you would put sort of cardboard cutouts on the screen. You can sometimes see this if you open the doors or whatever. Those were actually rendered in 3D. And it was pretty impressive at the time. I mean, heck, this is a game that, there was the sort of Metroid-like, but this was so good at being a Metroid-like game that it actually managed to get itself in the Metroidvania entire genre. So good job, you. Good job. But this is a very, very traditional style here. Like they're going in there, drawing these pixels in here. Although you will see, if you look, some of the statues and stuff do look kind of like they were rendered in 3D. Haven't quite gotten any official stance on that, but this is something you can do where you literally have a 3D world with 2D textures in it. And then you have Dead Cells. Dead Cells is kind of amazing. I don't want to necessarily go through the entire article, but there is an article. Where is it here? There we go. So this is definitely worth reading and actually echoes a bit of what we'll talk about here. But this is basically using a 3D pipeline for 2D animations, and it talks a great deal about how they were able to basically make in 3D these assets and then render them out and really save themselves a lot of time by automating many of these steps. And this is a theme that shows up a whole lot it's going to show up a whole lot in this talk. But you'll also notice that the style here is very, very, it's almost cell shaded in as much as there's no smooth gradient on the whatever the pants or the shirt or whatever the stuff is. There's no smooth gradients here. It's like two-tone color almost. So you can get this with shaders and stuff, but they definitely baked these things out. And then these are sprites that are in the game. Cool. Other things to consider, you want to see how other things in the game are going to interact with what you're making, like post-processing effects, UI elements, and actual 3D stuff, models, lighting, etc. There are camera details that you may need to keep in mind, depending on what you're doing. As a funny example, the Super Nintendo used something called Mode 7, so it sort of gave it a sort of 3D look. I don't want to go too deep into the weeds there, but if you know what I'm talking about, you got a good picture of that. And there are other things in your game that may interact with this, like physics and physical sims and particles and VFX, that sort of thing. Every single one of these kinds of interactions are going to influence everything downstream. And if you want your game to have a coherent style, you want to be looking at what your assets look like in the context of your game and not necessarily just in your editing program. Even if what you're looking at is the rendered files from Blender or whatever you're using, you want to take those and actually see them in the game. When I did my Factorio stuff, I very much had to sit down, render everything out, code everything in the game. It took a while. And then see what it was. And there was about a 2-week process of just tuning it so that it sort of agreed with the style of the game. And we'll see it in action a little bit later in the talk. So one thing to keep in mind as you're developing this, though, as you're working on your style, even the phrase is you can have something that's fast, good, or flexible or cheap or something, right? There's design pressures out there, and there's various axioms that maxims rather, that people use in order to capture this. I just want to point out that flexibility here is a design pressure. You want to be, as you're doing this, build knobs into your process that you can use and tune the look of your whatever your product happens to be. In particular, like if you're building something that has a palette, for example, like if you're trying to get things to agree on the screen when you put these things in the game, you're going to probably be tinkering with the palette. An example from, is it Asprite, whatever. You can essentially play with the palette there with indexed colors and change it on the fly. That is an example of building knobs into this and saying, you know what? I'm going to make this asset, but I'm going to make it changeable so that when I see it in the game, or when that game changes out from underneath me, I can keep up with it. I can make choices that make it continue to agree with whatever it is. So, give me 1 second here. In common, there are a bunch of common workflow threads here. I've essentially broken this down into 4 major touchstones. You've got your concept art and your blocking out phase. You've got the modeling and texturing and arranging in 3D phase, which can be either manual or procedural. We'll talk about both of those. And then there's the rendering phase. And then we're going to be talking about the post-processing phase. These can, of course, be further broken down, but these are the really big ones. One thing to keep in mind, I mentioned you want to build these knobs in there for flexibility. The other thing you want to be looking for are any step in the process that you could automate in some way. That is going to be huge. Essentially, if you automate these processes, you can quickly update the assets as needed to tune the style or correct any sort of problems you run into. You can make new assets in the same concept space. So, for example, let's say you wanted to make armor sets for your characters. You could, of course, just draw these out over and over again, where you have the traditional stuff we were talking about. You could do something where you take those traditionally made assets, and run them through some kind of process to change the colors. Or You could, if you're doing something in 3D, you can simply make a new model for this new armor and then just hit render, change the file names, drop them in the game. So this is something that you are essentially going to be able to, you're looking for anything where you can multiply whatever you've made in some way so that you can save yourself a whole lot of time. That is, you're going to be finding steps that are multiplicative. Maybe that means that you change this one piece over here and whatever that the build happens to be, and changing that one piece entirely recontextualizes it. So yeah, something to keep in mind. Automation always in the back of your mind here. So for the concept art and blocking out shapes in 3D is just as important as doing gesture drawing in 2D. Or maybe gesture drawing is the wrong one, but basically you block out your character in 2D. It's very quick to make and edit these things. It gives you a sense of space and scale, which is huge, especially because you're not dealing in literal 3D. You are dealing in a 2D projection of a 3D world. But there is something to keep in mind. You don't necessarily want the thing to linger so long on the page that it crystallizes on a design and it becomes difficult to edit. So just a sort of life thing to keep in mind. So for example, when I was working on one of my assets, this was going to be a roller, which you can obviously see here, right? That's what these cylinders and cubes mean, right? Well, that's fine. I didn't actually use these specific things. I just used these as a blockout and then went in and manually added all of the rest of the stuff around it. I know there's a little bit of like draw some circles and then draw the rest of the owl here, but this is more just to be an example of what that kind of looks like. PureRef, I'm going to take a moment and talk about this, is an absolutely fantastic program. I should have it open. Let's see, here we go. This is one that I use all the time. So for example, let's say I wanted to take a picture of this. So I'm going to grab a screenshot, concept art and block out. Oops, I'll tell you what, let me do this. Take my screenshot here. So we're going to take a screenshot of this. I'm going to go into PureRef and we're going to paste it here. Boom. So now this is over here. I don't know why I would do this, but that's sort of the workflow here. You can essentially take whatever's on your screen. In Windows, the shortcut, I guess in Windows 10, it's Shift Windows S, and then you can drag across the screen and get a screenshot. And what I did at least was I essentially collected an enormous amount of concept art here. And these things were resources I was using to make minerals, and excuse me, I was using to also work out stuff in the workflow. So, for example, I was having some trouble visualizing the way the different maps were put together here. So what I did was I took each one, took a screenshot, and then said, oh, okay, well, this is what this should look like. It also makes for good sharing of stuff. So like here, I made like a little teaser piece, something that would have taken me like many minutes if I were to render these things out and put them together in some software. But if all I'm doing is sharing a teaser, then just taking a couple of screen caps, throwing them together here, and then taking a screen cap of this, so meta, is totally acceptable. So I don't know. I love this program. It's free. I don't necessarily, I don't know. I use this all the time. Personally, I gave them a couple of bucks, but I don't necessarily want to, no one's paying me anything here. I am just a very passionate user of this program. So something to keep in mind, and to keep in your back pocket. So things to remember. As you're trying to find resources for this, cast a wide net, get inspiration from as many different places as you can. Be careful not to necessarily hew too close to others' designs. There's a legal distance you have to be between two things in order to not be brushing up against copyright. You probably want to be further than that. Be inspired, don't copy. I don't know. This is not necessarily the point of the talk, but this is something to keep in mind as you're doing this. So let's say you wanted to pick the manual modeling and texturing and arranging of stuff. This is still okay. Certainly something that I did. This is going to be domain specific, and the workflows that you'll use here are going to depend on whatever your style is. Unfortunately, this isn't something I can necessarily speak to you about because it's going to be whatever you're trying to make. Like for me, in Factorio, I was making models for icons and I was making models for entities. That being said, there are some questions you can ask yourself. How are the assets lit? Which is a very interesting question. So now let's dig into Blender here for a minute. So right now you can see I have one of my models. This is a welder. I'm going to take it from the rendered view here, and we're going to go to the solid view just so we can actually see it play. But what I can do is I can hit spacebar, and you can see I've got a little animation here. And so this right here excuse me, was something that I had to manually model. This was not something I could procedurally model. It wouldn't make any sense, really. I did make a kit bash for it, and that's a different talk. But essentially, I built a couple of assets and reused them here. So I made everything, but this was something that I used in all of the different mini assemblers, as I call them. And so they have a unified look, but the end result is I have to go through and render all these frames out. And there are some tools I use to help with that. I'll talk a bit about in the rendering section. But how is this thing lit? This is huge, as it turns out, because as I mentioned earlier from the Donkey Kong Country example, the lighting there was kind of all over the place. In Factorio, that's not necessarily the case. The lighting is coming from the upper left down at a 45-degree angle. And to that end, I actually have, for each one of these things, a common lighting scheme. And so you can see I've got here the thing like the horizontal main camera, and I've got different things to show it from different angles. But I have the common sun horizontal. I have two vertical suns because I might be rendering this from different sides. You can see I've got the three cameras here, which can get different angles on this. And if I turn these on, it'll become completely blown out. But that's because it has 3 times the amount of light this thing is meant to have. If I set this up like so, you can see the lighting is coming in from the side here. If I set the lighting like so, you can see it's now going the other way. So this would be facing this way. So this is something that you want to consider because you want your assets to agree. Like I said earlier in the Donkey Kong Country example, in fact, let me just go back up here. Excuse me. I personally would suggest not necessarily having the lighting disagree this strongly. Like I said, it's a style, but at least for what I'm going for, I would rather have it consistent. It is a question, though, that you should ask. That's why I'm sort of styling this as a question that you should ask yourself and not necessarily saying this is how you should do it. Like I said, these are domain-specific things, and it's going to depend on what you're going for. Should your stuff mimic traditional 2D art styles or have a baked 3D look? This is more towards the Donkey Kong Country thing, and the 2D art styles sort of hew closer to the Dead Cells stuff. What's the resolution of your game? This is not necessarily obvious because, we've got the world of cell phones and all these different resolutions it could be, but you still kind of have an idea of what you want it to look like on your screen. And so, for example, I think it was 427 by 200 was what I rendered my weapons at for Project Brutality. So I had an idea of what my target resolution was. So keep that in mind as you're making this stuff. If the assets are going to be scaled, how will it look in the context of other elements? For example, in Duke Nukem 3D, there would sometimes be a texture that was super detailed, but it wasn't detailed. It was just shrunken, and it kind of disagreed with everything around it. It kind of jarred a bit. Do you need multiple angles to face the camera? So this is kind of what I was talking about here. If you need to do something like this mini assembler here, then I would need 3 of these angles here. But if you're doing something like a character animation, maybe you only need 1. Or if you're making a 3D shooter and you need multiple angles, maybe you need those. There's different scenarios, and it's something to keep in mind because each one of these camera angles that you do here is going to require another pass of rendering. You're going to have to render all the frames, and this is one of your multipliers, and not the kind that says, "Hey, look, this is how you make new stuff." Rather, this is how many frames you need multiplier. So very, very important to keep in mind. Okay, so that's basically sort of the modeling stuff here. Let me open another file. And this will talk more about the procedural aspect of things. Excuse me. When should you do a procedural sort of workflow here? Well, there's a couple of questions you can ask. Do you need a lot of variations? Is the product you're making sort of math heavy, involving discrete or small steps, aka failure points? In this particular instance, what I'm talking about is, let's say you have something where you want to put these things on there and arrange them just so. Every single time you have to do a thing in a process that is going to be done many, many, many times over, each one of those small steps becomes a failure point because you're going to inevitably forget, and then someone's going to have to catch that, whether that's QA, whether that's future you, whatever. So just keep that in mind, that if it is something that's math heavy or has all these discrete steps, if this is something that you can do procedurally, then this might be a good time to or this might be a good time to do it procedurally. I said that backwards, but yeah. Will built-in automation of this process offer a time saving for some other reason? There are a couple of reasons for this. And basically, these are things that they're not like hard rules, but they should clue you in that you should be thinking about doing something procedurally. So let me give you an example of this. Geometry and shader nodes in Blender are absolutely amazing. I have done many, 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 many dozens of streams of doing just these things. So let's actually take a look at this. So this is a pile of rocks. So congratulations, you exist. What this is a completely procedural thing. So let me just scroll in over here. Oh, for heaven's sake. Here we go. So as I move the playhead around, I get a completely new pile of rocks. So this is what procedural generation looks like. So what I can do here, and I'm not going to do this live on stream or it will hang the stream, is I will hit Control F12 and I will render these out. You in Blender control that by going to the output here. There's a file name and path. You'll notice that if I click on the little file icon here, I've got these things here. It basically is a file name and I leave a dash here. It's going to then do some kind of enumeration. That enumeration is going to start at like 0 and go through whatever. You can tinker with that a little bit if you need to. But the bottom line is that you can essentially, in one keystroke, set your computer to rendering and just do all of these at once and get a whole bunch of different variations. And these are things that would take a great deal of time to do manually. I accomplished this with GeoNodes. I do want to be very careful here because I will spend the entire talk discussing GeoNodes easily. But basically what this is a way of creating something in Blender geometry-wise from whole cloth. Basically, you can start with primitives, you can start with an object that you've made here, whatever. The sky is the limit here. It's absolutely revolutionary, and it's nuts that, again, that it's free, but rather that it's something that's being put into this. I haven't seen this anywhere else. I mean, there may be that is somewhere else. I haven't seen everything. But basically what I've done is I've started with a seed. All this thing is, if I go into here, there we go, is a value. And I've put it through all these different layers here for automation purposes. I don't necessarily want to go into the details here, but suffice it to say that if I want to make a whole bunch of these pebbles clumpy things, and I want to change the seed here procedurally, I can just change it in this one spot, and then it changes it everywhere else in the program. I add 1 to it to sort of add 1 to everything. This basically means anytime I'm adding 1, I'm going to change the seed. So if I'm doing a randomization thing here, it needs a seed. You know, sometimes I'll do a random value here. It needs a seed, another random value seed, et cetera, et cetera. You'll notice that sort of a theme here. I'm giving it different seeds just in case there could be some kind of overlapping. It doesn't often happen, but when it does, it gets annoying and it's kind of hard to track down. So I've just sort of done this as part of my process. I have a seed here that I start with, and then I add 1 to it every time I need a new seed. Okay. And in here, this is another set of nodes. So I just hit tab to go into the group here. And the idea here is that I do something like take a noise texture. I subtract a value, I scale it, and then I separate the X, Y, and Z, and I do something. The details here are not necessarily that important. I'm starting with a cone. I'm deleting, it looks like I'm deleting the bottom out of it. I'm setting position with this random thing here, so that's in some way randomizing the position. I'm then subdividing the mesh, which means I'm getting more geometry to work with. And then I'm doing some craziness involving this curve here, more randomization. And at the end of this, I have probably a hill. So I can like click on this, see, get the viewer here. And let's head over to solid view. So at the end of this step, this is what I get. I took a cone, I did some randomization to it, and I got this hill. Okay. So it doesn't really matter what the different steps are. Again, like I said at the beginning, I'm a little nervous about being the guy with the Rubik's Cube solving it too quickly. I don't want you to get so lost in the weeds that you look at this and say, how on earth could he have done all this? I promise that if this is something you dig into, this stuff will make sense. Just for right now, the big high-level takeaway is I took a basic shape, a cone, and I added randomization to it. Then I put some points on this face. So I took whatever that hill was, and I distributed a whole bunch of random points on it. Then I did some more crunching on it, and I brought over this to, let's see, spawn some points on this, or take those points, and I spawned some, in this case, primitives. These were icospheres that each got randomized a bit to look kind of like a rock. The way they were randomized, that's what this stuff in here was for. This stuff influenced that randomization procedure. This then gets sent out through here where I give it some smoothness. Technically, this is where I put the texture on it, although you can't tell in solid mode here. But if I like clicked on this, you can see that it's faceted. If I click on this, you can see it goes to smooth. And then finally, like if I look through the camera, you can see it's going outside of here. I made a geonode group that all it does is it sort of centers it and makes it so that it doesn't go outside the camera frame. So all that does is it basically allows me to connect up these nodes in a way that allows me to change these things on a frame by frame basis. Now, where does that happen? So, excuse me. You'll notice that if I go in here to this top level seed, I'm taking this seed value here and I'm adding the frame to it. So essentially, right now I'm adding 0 to it, and that 0 value is being added to whatever this ID is. I think it's 51. Yep. And then that frame value is 51 at the beginning of this seed process. And then for the next one, this will be 52 because it's the frame plus that 51. And then I add 1 to each one of those for each individual seed here. And what you'll notice is that's all it takes in order to get a completely new thing. And with this, you can basically make whatever you want: trees, bushes, rocks, creatures. It doesn't matter. As long as you can capture whatever it is you're working with in some kind of node structure, you can make your own thing. And you can do it procedurally, which means it scales. So for example, with this was something that I was working on for my for the mod that I'm making. And what I did was I said, you know what? I'm going to make a whole bunch of different types of things. Some of these are going to be like chalks or chatoyant things or sandstones, marbles, etc. These are all textures, but then they're also sort of shape influencers. So like the fact that it's a chatoyant could make it. I might do it smooth so that it shows up. So whatever. The idea is that I made a list of stuff that I wanted to make, and then oops, didn't mean to click on that. And then where is the thing? I got lost. I basically go into here and make a whole bunch of different things. So this is the pebbles. I've also technically got, let me go ahead and turn that off. I've also got gravel. So I can turn these on. And the gravel looks like this. I've also got some even gravel, which is a little bit different. And I've got some very chunky gravel. It should have giant chunks in it. There's a big chunk there. I have all sorts of stuff. It doesn't matter to go through all of these, but basically I can make a whole lot of these things. And that's great. I think this is something that is, once you set this thing up, you're now in a position where you've kind of done the heavy lifting, and now you can take advantage of that and render out as many frames as you'll need for your thing. If you're familiar with Blender, you also might know of things like basic modifiers, noise textures, and displacement maps. This was the old way they used to do it. And I say old way like they somehow still don't. They do. But basically, if you go into modifiers here, this was the original way of doing procedural generation. And it's still there. They haven't taken them out. Geometry nodes, in fact, is just a modifier. It's just one that's super duper duper flexible. So do keep that in mind. Scripting can work too if you're keen about that. Like if you are up for learning the Python API. Essentially, in Blender, you do have access to the code here. So when I say the code, it's not like Blender source code, but it is the Blender runs in Python basically. And if, let's say I wanted to go into here and I wanted to automate a process in the code here, this is like the text editor. I could make a new text file, and now I can type in stuff, and I can zoom in so anyone can read that. Basically what I can do is if I added a cube, I now have a command here that shows up on my command prompt, and I could go in here and I could copy this and I could paste that here, and oops, voila. Now, if I wanted to, I can use this for, whoa, cannot get this thing to look good. There we go. All I have to do here is edit this code, and then I can create something different. You can run these. You got a little play button here, so you can treat this script as an actual thing you can work with. Excuse me. So While I am personally not super up on scripting myself, I have done a little bit with it. And I can say that if you are someone who's adept with it, this is a very, very good option and can help you with pretty much anything with automation. Add-ons are a thing to look into as well. Many are paid but inexpensive. I've already mentioned a few of those and some of the risks. So do keep those in mind. But they can be a good solution, especially if you just need to knock something out really quickly. There are a number of systems in Blender that help with batching procedures. I've talked a little bit about the frame value and the seed values. Another quick little hack. So this is sort of getting into the weeds here, but let's undo that. If I undo that, it's not going to undo it. There it goes. All right. So another thing you can do, if I just wanted something to have the frame in it for some reason, like I don't necessarily want this to do it, what I can do is I can click on this and I can say hashtag frame. It'll turn purple. And now, oh, it doesn't like that. Something's wrong there. Frame. Why is the multiply value angry at me? Anyways, the idea is normally that would be the frame value. For some reason, it's not. Let me see. Value. There we go. Frame. 0. Something's up. Anyways, normally you can type in hashtag frame. Maybe that's only for shader nodes, but that shouldn't be. So I've done it here. You can see I've got the W value is there. This is a frame plus 6 or 5. And so if I change the value here, when it renders, it'll change it to 2 different value. For some reason, it's not updating. I don't know if I'm like in edit mode or something. There's some kind of interaction going on. I've screwed something up. Sorry. But basically, that's a way of quickly getting that frame. So just a thing. There is something called the simulation zone in Blender. What this allows you to essentially, let me bring this up. So let me make a new thing. So we'll make a new cube. And I'll go in here. I'll give it a new GeoNodes group. And what I'm going to add in here is a simulation zone. And I'll connect the output of so connect this input here to there. And I'll connect the output and over here. And so something is going to happen here to that geometry, and it'll happen once per frame. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, you know what, set position. And we're going to essentially add 1 to we're going to say the delta time, we're going to add that to the current offset. So I'll add in a combine XYZ. I'm going to say the original position. Okay. I'm going to do a separate XYZ. I'll explain a little bit about this. Again, this is that Rubik's Cube problem. I'm going to take the original position. I'm going to say keep the X and the Y values. But I'm going to say add, so math. They do tend to combine a lot of different nodes into one. So this one math node is your add, multiply, subtract, and everything. So we're going to go add the delta time plus the Z value, make that our new Z value, and set that as our new position. So now this is going to move up a little bit each time, just a little bit. So if I make this a little bit bigger, you can see it more drastically. So this is going to move up as time goes on. So what this simulation zone does is it gives you access to the actual time that's passed. This delta time is going to be dependent on your frame rate. And that frame rate is usually determined somewhere in here, units. I forget exactly where it lives. I have to go find it each time I need to change it. But basically, you change the frame rate somewhere here. It doesn't matter. Oh, here it is, frame rate. So basically, this is telling you what your delta time is. So it'll take 24 frames for this thing to go 1 second, which means it'll go up 1 unit. And you can change that to be whatever you needed. So simulation zone, very handy. Similarly, there's a thing called the repeat zone, which is very similar. The difference, of course, is that this does not actually tie into the timeline. Sorry about that. This does not tie into the timeline at all. So if I did this, it just wouldn't, if I try to do something similar to this, it wouldn't work. What I could do, however, is I could essentially take this thing here, I'll Control D, and I'll take this geometry, set position node here, and we'll connect that up. And now what you'll see is that it's going to add essentially half to this however many times. So let me add so if I wanted this to go once, it'll go once and it'll add just a half to it. I can see that. from looking at it from here. If I go 0 times, it adds nothing. If I go 1 time, it adds half, 2 times, 3 times, so on and so forth. This is not tied to the time frame. So I can do this as many times as I want, independently of the time frame. So, excuse me. So these are some very, very awesome systems to help you with whatever automation that you want to do in Blender. If you want to learn more about this, do feel free to ask me after. I can give you some YouTube resources, but I cannot express to you how powerful this is. This is huge. So yeah. See, another thing, which is not necessarily 3D, is something called Pixel Composer. This is something that's recently come across my radar. I saw it a few months ago. I haven't actually gotten a chance to dig into this. But what this is essentially something that's very similar to shaders, except it has so much more inside of this. It's absolutely ridiculous. You have things where you can make palettes, and I mean make palettes, not just, you pick colors, but like you mix things together. It has a huge variety of shader nodes, not shader nodes, but just nodes in general. You can read from files. You can use images. You've got input and outputs from just about anything. You've got 3D stuff in here. You've got MIDI in. That's right. You can actually drive whatever this stuff is from a MIDI. You can transform this. It's got several different noise things in here, so values. You can do whatever you want with arrays and such. You can sort them, etc. Like I said, you can do 3D stuff, so you actually have things in here in 3D that you have cameras that you can move around. You can create normal maps. You've got the obvious things like filters. It feels very, very much like a cross between Blender's shader nodes and a bit of Substance Designer's shader nodes. Excuse me. But it seems it's doing its own thing. You can draw in here. Like if I go into the workspace, oops, crap, that's not what I want to do. You can go into the workspaces and you can go and you can draw in here. You've got, this is where the palette would be if I had something to work with. But it's amazing. There's just so much you can do with this little thing. It costs $10. The guy's working on it all the time. So I don't know. Very much want to get into this. Just haven't quite yet had a use case for it personally, because mostly what I'm doing is in Factorio. That's all. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, so now the rendering step. This is where things get a bit spicy. So automation is particularly important here because this is a very time-expensive step. Get this one wrong, and you are going to spend some time fixing it. Redoing stuff here is expensive. So like if I'm rendering out a bunch of icons, it's not necessarily cheap. I might have to do like 12 or 24 or some number of icons. And if I get it wrong, then I've got to tell my computer, go do that thing, and I have to go do something else. So do keep that in mind. Render set is something that I love. So let me open up this again. Don't save. And I'll show you what render set is. This is just so cool. I'm going to hit N to open up the N panel here. And I'm going to bring this down. This is the render set panel. What this does is it creates contexts. And a context specifically refers to the combination of active collections. So again, I'm going to assume you don't know much about Blender. Blender says, okay, look, you've got a bunch of objects. These objects might be meshes. So here are some meshes here. They might be curves, which is a slightly different data type, but it essentially says, let me make this curve in a sort of vectory style, if you will. They're Bezier curves. And then from that curve will emerge this mesh that you can determine based on little knobs you can tune. It could be empties. So this is basically an empty. This doesn't actually render, but it gives you a position in space that you can use to drive other things. You've got armatures. So this is something, again, that does not render, but like if I go into the pose mode here, it's going to go berserk. I can move this over here and it's flickery. I need to fix this. It still works. It just sometimes goes a bit bazonkers. Actually kind of hilarious. Anyways, let's just undo our way out of that because, oh my God. At any rate, so the idea is that you have all of these different objects here. They have different visibilities, so you can turn them on and off in renders. That's what this button does here. So if I turn this off there, you don't see anything because we're not looking at a render. But if I turn this off, it goes away because we're looking at the stuff in the viewport. And both of these need to be enabled for this. If you're wondering why there's 2 here, it's because there are different scenes that you can do this stuff between, and one of these influences just what you're looking at here. One's across the scenes. Now, the hope is, if I were to go, let me go into render real quick. The hope is if you do this right, you can arrange things to show up or not show up in your different passes automatically, and then just hit a render key and you win. In this particular instance, that looks like me saying, okay, well, let me go into the here, into this context. You'll notice things changed. So the what things are turned on or off is now different. If I click here, it's different again. If I click here, it's different again. If I click here, here, it's very different. You can see that I've essentially gotten rid of everything and only left the shadow on the thing, on the floor here. I've got the shadow horizontally and the shadow vertically. Both of these are sensitive to the sunlight, as I mentioned earlier. You're going to want to make sure that you know what direction your object is being lit by. And so what I've done is I've essentially said, let me make a context here, which is just a combination of these things being turned on or off. And what else that allows me to do is then I can go ahead and check tick marks here and turn them on and off here. And then I can just render these contexts. So if I need to make a whole bunch of different passes, I can come in here, change these things to being whatever I want for each individual context, and then hit render all. Now let's say I screwed up, and this definitely happened so many times when I was going through this process. Excuse me. And I need to change something across all of them. For example, let me go in here to the base. You see this green light here? It turns out that I screwed up the texture on it. And at one point, it was the wrong color. On was off was on. And I had to change that for everything. So all I did was I came in, I checked the tick boxes, and I re-rendered out the frames with it correct. Very fast compared to what I would have had to do otherwise. This is what I was talking about with scaling. So when you do something manually by hand and you come in with your pixel art, it may be that going through 25 frames and doing this for one thing isn't so onerous, but then do it for however many you have in your game and realize that what you're doing if you don't have these sort of processes is you're building in inertia. You're saying, I've put so much effort into specifying exactly what this thing should look like that if it ever needs to change and all the other things next to it, it's just going to be unwieldy and I'm not going to be able to do it. Versus if you have this sort of workflow set up, you can be very quick and go in and change it. It takes away much of that momentum to being where it is, and you can take it to where it needs to be instead. So very, very big deal. This is what costs $60. What's even funner is that you can set the camera details. You can set whatever else you need here, like the resolution, which does change. I have different resolutions for all of these things. You've got a bunch of the different settings that you would need to set in the render tab here. You've also got your output settings here, which includes file path and all that good stuff. You can even do post-render actions, which is humongous. That one got added after got added here after I was really doing all this stuff. So it's something I haven't quite messed with. You can change what your world settings are. There's a compositor here that it can't really deal with too much, but you can do some with it. And this was something that if you're a Blender user will make more sense. Essentially, all of these objects here are broken up into data blocks, mesh, materials, etc. And each one of them can have a custom property associated with it. So that data block, if it's a mesh, you can throw a property on there. Excuse me. It's kind of like assigning a variable to a class, if you will. And you just make up your variables as you go along, and you can use them wherever you need to. Well, it turns out that with the render set's most recent one, you can now add properties to this, meaning you can now change on-the-fly textures. You can't do everything with these contexts, right? Like I said, you can just turn these things on and off. You can't really change the materials here, but you can make a smart material that's sensitive to a custom property and then change this here. And now you can, if you set it up properly, change the materials per context. That's huge. So again, I know it sounds like I'm just touting I'm basically, I don't say shilling, but I'm basically telling you about all these wonderful things. Some of them cost money, some of them don't, but I really can't speak highly of this enough. I love it. So it tracks collections, crucial scene data, custom properties. I already know those. You can use the Blender Python scripting and the CLI, the command line interface. I've mentioned a little bit about Python scripting in the past, but you can also use the command line interface. So you can actually run Blender in a headless mode. It's not something that I've ever done because I basically am at my computer. I'm not cool enough to have a render farm. But if you do have like extra computers you can use for this, you can just throw it out there. Again, there are some questions you would want to consider. What do the border pixels look like? This is a thing that tends to show up a whole lot. So let's go into Photoshop. Here is just something that I've rendered. It's in way too high res. And I would need to maybe come in and change this down to something much smaller if I was going to use it in the game. Spoiler alert, I actually used this for my thumbnail for some of my Blender tutorial videos. So I could come in here and I can say, you know what, let's do an image size reduction. And you can do it in a couple of ways. Normally what happens is you have it set to automatic here. And let's say I set this to, let's not even say by percent, let's go pixels. Let's say we did this to 64 pixels. Well, it's going to get small. And you can see here we have these sort of fuzzy pixels here. Another thing that you can do with PureRef, let me rope that in here, is I can do A/B comparisons pretty quickly. So if I go into PureRef now, I can say, you know what, there's this with regular auto anti-aliasing stuff. Let's undo that. And I'll just use the thing. So Control I. And we're going to do that again, but this time we're going to set this to nearest neighbor. This is going to give us, hopefully, sharper and crunchier pixels. So now, zoom in again, we have crunchy pixels. And if you would like, we can look at these as an A/B comparison. Excuse me. And you can see we have soft pixels here and crunchy pixels here. You still do have a little bit of that going on here because of, I guess, rounding errors. I'm not entirely sure. But basically, this is going to depend on what your style is. Seen from a super distance, it's not going to be that big of a deal. But if this is something that's very, very close to the user, you're going to want to make sure that you are very aware of how you're doing this. This is just one of those kind of considerations, right? Something to keep in mind as you're making these. Some things to keep in mind, other things to keep in mind are, can you break up the composition into pieces and layer them in the game? So as an example of this, in my Factorio mod, I think I have the directory open here. I essentially had to make a bunch of different layers here for everything that I wanted to do. It's a little hard to see, so I'll zoom in. But I've got a sparks layer here. So these are the different frames of animation. These are the frames that have sparks. I've got the base actual animation itself. Here's the roller. And that's what it looks like in the game. I've got this right here. This is a mask. And all this does is it is color data for the oxidation. And then I tint it in the game. So that's kind of why I have Factorio open right now, is so that you can sort of see how that looks. So if I go to a spot that has that particular art asset in it, right here, you can see I've got the roller in the game. And let's say I set it going. So I'll move those out. And now all of a sudden, if you look, you can see that these things are colored based on this metal. So this metal here, this titanium, has these colors here. And it's being colored entirely inside of the game engine using those masks. If I go down to here, you'll notice it looks very different. So if I take these items here, there we go. It's going to look, very different. Sorry, it's hard for me to control my character. He moves very fast. But you can see it's gold instead of just gray, like we have here. And you can see you've got green oxidation instead of white. So this is the kind of thing that if you are clever and you can find a way to sort of stack these assets together, you can kind of get a whole lot of variety, added detail, basically all good stuff. So something to keep in mind as you're going through this, to be asking yourself, can you break this thing up into pieces and layer them in the game? If you're talking about characters, this could be something simpler, like you were talking about, like swords and shields and armors or whatever. So yeah. Can you bake these into masks? That's kind of what I just showed you there, shading them in the game. And all the previous questions applies to, obviously. Excuse me. The post-processing. This is the part that no one likes to think about because it's generally pretty boring. Hang on a second, take my hoodie off. I closed the door, so now it's trapping all the heat in my office. Pardon me. Okay. Post-processing. Manual edits are tempting. So what do I mean? Like, let's say you render the thing and it looks amazing, except there's these pixels off over here, and you want to change that. That's fine, but there are some things to remember. Keep track of what you do so that future you can replicate it if you need to, i.e. if you have to make changes pre-rendering but want to keep the same look. So what I mean by pre-rendering, all of the stuff in Blender, you know what, you can just settle down there. In Blender, this is all the pre-rendering stuff. I'm arranging the elements so that they will render. This is in the pre-rendering phase. Post-rendering would be like me coming into here and going into Photoshop and saying, you know what, that red light isn't bright enough. I'm going to brighten this up for all these different pieces here. So if I need to make an edit at this stage, I then need to remember what I did at this stage so that I can recreate that. And as you can tell, that's going to be adding in that inertia I was talking about earlier. That's going to make it difficult for you to make those kinds of edits. So just keep that in mind. I'm not saying you can never do it, but it is one of those things where you want to be very careful if you must, and keep notes so that future you can replicate this if you must. Krita is great for painting, and it is free, but there are other tools out there like Sprite. Oops, I just clicked twice. Excuse me. So these are things that you can use for, I don't know how you go back. You go back to this one button? There we go. This is something that you can use. I use Krita a little tiny bit, but basically it is a free painting software. Sprite is not that expensive, and it is something that many people that I know swear by. It's got a pixel aesthetic in its own editor, so that definitely is going for it. They're passionate about what they do. But don't over-engineer making these assets. So this is something to keep in mind. I'll talk about this in a second, actually. Procedural edits are great, but wait. With procedural edits, you can do color grading and framing and cropping and other edits. These things are stuff that you can do with. These are things that you can do here pretty quickly and easily. So if future you has to do this, this is just like a text file that says frame it and crop it however. But there is something that you can do that is better than just keeping a text file, and that is batch processing. So batch processing is something that Photoshop has. It's basically something where you automate a process and do it over and over again. It has what are called drops. These are little tiny files that can make that if you put them in a directory and run it, it'll essentially do those Photoshop steps there. On the other hand, if you like Affinity Photo, which I'm becoming much more enamored with as time goes on, basically it has something called macros, which more or less fills that same space. So what I've done is I've prepared as an example, where is it? There we go. I've got a bunch of files here. These are little letters that I use for one of my mods. And the idea is I wanted to create MIP maps for these things. That is to say, smaller variants of these that are shown, they're rendered when the camera is pulled out far away so that it has less stuff to think about and it renders faster. So to that end, what we can do is I can go File, Automate, Batch. And what I've done is I've set up a set here. It's called MIP Make. And I'm going to use MIP Make, the original one. I have this for 3, 2, and 1 variants. Don't need to talk about that right now. Just understand there's different versions of this. And then I'm going to pick this folder. So let me go ahead and copy and paste this over to here. So choose, go paste. And so I'm going to select this folder. And what it's going to do is it's going to take these and it's actually going to make edits to it. So if I click OK, it's going to flash here for a second. So I'm actually going to go out of that screen so that anyone who has any sort of epilepsy is not bothered. There we go. But as you can see live, it's actually editing the files one at a time. And what's happening is it's just running through a process of actions iteratively. I stopped it at K just so it didn't go on forever. Yes, the rest of the alphabet is in the game, I promise. Excuse me. But now you can see they're all different. And it's live. Like, this is hard save. There isn't any undoing this that I know of. There is a way to undo it. It has like a built-in thing. But essentially, this is once you do this, you're making live edits on your hard drive. The way it works is that if I go over here, I have an actions panel. And as you can see, I have a collection here called MIP Make. And inside of MIP Make, I have 4 different things I can do. And I can go in and I can see what I've done. There's a system here where you can record and stop and pause and do whatever. And once you learn how to use that system, you essentially can create a sequence of operations that you can then run as that batch process. Very, very handy. And honestly, this is something that I wish I had known about earlier for various other things that I did. But this is something that's also in Affinity Photo. I have not used the macros yet, but this is something that's on my list of stuff to do. But this is a very good way for future you, I should say, to keep track of what's happening so that if you need to, you can go through and make these edits and not have to worry about remembering, oh, where did I put the pixel? Even Lightroom can help here. That is completely random. I'll save this for the end if people want to see it, but you can actually do something in Lightroom where you can change colors in a way that is actually designed more for photographs, but you can repurpose that to edit colors in textures here and then just keep that process in a file. It's a bit of a hack. Honestly, I can't really see myself doing much with it, although I did try it at one point. It's just that the things that I needed to do tended to be things I could do in Photoshop, but it is really interesting that it's even possible. So just a thing to keep in mind. But the thing I was mentioning about not over engineering these assets was it takes time to build procedural workflows. Sometimes doing it manually really is better. Experience is the best teacher here. So, like, there are going to be times when you say, you know what, I could sit here and I can spend 5 hours working out how to automatically procedurally make this thing with automation, or I could spend half an hour and do it once. And if I ever need to edit it again, come back and do so because who cares, right? So there definitely is a thing to keep in mind there. That is going to be something that you get through experience with your own comfortable or level of comfort with these processes. I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you that there is no one size fits all here. Keep in mind both of these things have their places: manual edits and procedural edits. Okay. Um, Another thing is file naming. So as you noticed with Blender, it essentially is going to create file names here, and I can't really control too much what goes on with them. I mean, I can. I can, of course, give them an actual name. Like if I have this horizontal base here for the welder, I can come into the output and I can actually give it a name and I can tell it what to call it, etc. But the problem is that it's going to just put its own numbering system at the end. And while I can just use that, it may be that there are some needs in my workflow, in my engine, in my whatever it is, my collaboration, that is going to require me to rename all these things. And this advanced renamer is absolutely amazing. You literally, it's like you'll see I've got a rule here. In fact, let me just show you one of the things that I used a lot. So if I go into a new stock thing here, actually, let's do something different. Let's do the machined parts. Here we go. So basically, what this does is it essentially says, let me get a bunch of files and change it in some way. So what I initially did here was I would say, okay, I'm going to, in fact, let me open the file. I don't know if I have it in the recent file. I didn't anticipate this little tiny bit. Let's go to intermediates. Let's go to machined parts. Or actually, wait, no, we got the icon generator here. Fine. Let's open this. Okay, so what I've got is, let me set my initial frame to 0. What I've got is a set of items here. And what you'll notice is, I'll hit tab, that I have these things keyframed. And what these keyframes typically do is they turn things on and off. So you can see I've got the wiring, I've got this plating here, or paneling. But what it boils down to is that I turn these things on and off in renders. What you'll notice is that if I go here and I hit render, I get this thing, right? So fabulous, that's great. But what happens if I go here? Why isn't it moving? Hello. Can I click and drag you? You're not going to click and drag? No. Oh, Blender is frozen because it was calculating the thing. Fine. So now if I hit render here, it's not going to be that thing. It's going to be something else. This looks like the large gearing. So you'll notice that if I turn this off and turn the large gearing on, where's the regular gearing? There we go. You'll notice it has a keyframe here that turns it on. Okay. So the reason I did this, excuse me, was so that I could essentially hit Control F12, render all the frames. And what ends up happening is that each of these individual items gets turned on for one frame, rendered, and then it moves on to the next. And then what I do is I come into Advanced Renamer and I say, okay, the 000th frame is wiring. So text to be replaced, take this number here and replace it with wiring. And then for this one, it's 001 becomes paneling. And 0002 becomes shielding, and so on and so forth. These aren't the only things you can do. I literally have a bit of script in here somewhere, I think. These are all replaces. There is a, maybe it was the other one, but there is a, let's see, is it the stocks? Probably the stocks. There we go. So I've got the script here. I literally have a bit of JavaScript in here where I go in and I programmatically change the code for this. And it's very, very, very easy to use. If I want to add some files to this directory here, I just take these files, add them in, and then you can see what the file names are, and then you can see what the new file name will be after your process is done, and then you can start the batch and it'll work. And if it's not seeing anything, like you can notice that this is the same as this, then nothing changes. But like, let's say, let me clear everything, clear, and let me make a new one. Let's say I wanted to uh, say replace. So replace signal with Jeff. I don't know why I would replace the word signal in this file name with Jeff, but there you go. And you can do so. You can add on numbers. You can do whatever you want with this thing. Again, free. Everything that I've said here is free. I personally have kicked a couple of dollars to the person who makes it. Highly suggest other people do it too, because they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart. But this is huge. This saves so much time. And this is particularly where it comes into play. Excuse me. It is cold pressed Latin and magic science space currency. Okay. Have a path to the engine you're using that is fast and automated. I can't quite tell you what this is going to look like for your engine. It could be like a Blender to Godot thing. It could be Blender to Unity or Unreal or whatever it is you're using. But the point is that you want to have some kind of path that moves swiftly. You don't want to be caught up doing this step over and over again. Work out sprite sheet organization before doing a ton of rendering. So for sprite sheet organization, this is something that there are two major things that I like to think about. One, am I going to be doing like a bunch of different animations in one file? And two, am I going to be doing a bunch of like, swords or shields or whatever in another file? Basically, how am I layering these things together? I personally use Sprite Handler for this, and I really enjoy it. But this is one of the few that I'm going to say I don't necessarily recommend everyone go out and buy. I don't recommend anyone go out and buy anything. I don't want to hashtag not financial advice. But in particular, this one, I feel like there's a bunch of free alternatives. To that end, though, what I've done personally is I'll come in here. Let me not open up my mineral generator again. I have my designing area. So this is where if I'm moving stuff around, this is where I'll edit it. I have my nodes area. This is where I work here. And then I have my output area. And what this is where I use Sprite Handler. And all this does is it compiles stuff. So like, let me hit the X there. I'll say sprite sheet from files. I'll go into miscellaneous in this particular instance. And let me say, I'll get these 9 files here, 0 through 8. I'll say make it XLs. That means how many sprite sheets is it across? I'll say 3. And I'll hit OK. And then boom, it'll give me a sprite sheet that quickly. And then I can just go into here, image, save as, and do whatever. This is just the plain old image editor in Blender, right? So, excuse me. This is a very, very handy way of putting these things together. And I like it, but it also does have some limitations, which makes me wonder what the other free options out there look like. I can tell you that at least in the world of Factorio, there was a person named, and I'm going to say it wrong, it's Fgart, F-G-A-R-D-T. And what he made was something called Spriter, and it essentially made these. What it did was it took the actual renders and it cut out all the extra space. You can tell it to give it padding if you want. I told it to just compact the thing. And basically, it got rid of all the extra stuff. That's why, for example, this looks so tiny as compared to the other one, because all this kept was the actual file here, the content of that file here. The actual render was much larger. In order to use it, though, it is a command line interface tool. So let me go into VS Code. And it essentially looked like this. I created some like batch files where I essentially said, you know what, let me change the directory and then do the command and then do the stuff. So, I mean, this is something you can do. I then went into a PS1 file, which is something you can use in Windows PowerShell. Please be careful. You can hose your computer with this one. But basically, excuse me, I wrote a script here that all it does is it essentially goes through and does all the stuff that I would normally want in these couple of lines of code here. This, again, comes back to the thing I've been saying this whole talk, is that if you're keen with scripting, it can save you a bunch of time. So definitely something to keep in mind there. Okay. So there are some extensions to this. There are 3D PBR, which means physical-based rendering or physics-based rendering or whatever, techniques in 2D. So this is one of those things where you can get this from a number of different sources. Blender can make these PBR maps. So like if I go into here, let me go into a new one real quick. Don't save, doesn't matter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to render this in EV. So you can see I've got this cube here. I'm going to give it a shader. And all I'm going to do with this shader, we're going to keep this really simple. All I'm going to do, let me snip this even. Now it's not going to show up at all. It should be turning black, I think, but I don't know if EV is different. I'm going to say normal. Let's see, object data. This is geometry. And I'm going to render out the normals. And so you can see this one's green because it's pointing in the positive Y direction. This is black because it's -1 in that value. You can see this is red here because it's +1 in the X direction. And you can see that the Z here is blue because it's +1 in the Z direction. Just as a fun little fact, RGB, red, green, blue, X, Y, Z. So the RGB and X, Y, Z match up. The R is the X, the G is the Y, and the Z is the B. So that's why they're colored the way they are. But you can notice that this side is all black because they're negative. What you can do here, however, to get a better look is you can, let's say, let's put in the Suzanne monkey head. So this is the mascot for Blender. Where's monkey? Mesh. Monkey. This is the mascot for Blender, Suzanne. I believe it was the monkey from Jane Silent Bob Strike Back. I am not kidding. I don't know if I wish I were. Actually, I'm quite happy with not. I think that's amazing. But if I go into here, you can now see we have the normals. And if I actually give this a smooth surface here, then we can now see we have smoother normals. And let's say I wanted to look at it from here. Well, cool. Now what I can do is I can render this, and I can render out these normals and use them for something. One game that did an amazing job with this, like absolutely knocked it out of the park, was a Medieval. So Medieval, this axe right here, this is a sprite with a normal map. I mean, it's a couple of other maps too. It's got like a reflective map. It's got a couple of other things, but this is a 3D first-person shooter, I think made in the Unreal Engine. Yeah. And basically, they created a sprite for their main weapon. It doesn't look like a sprite. That looks like an actual 3D thingamabob. But like if you go down here, you can see what the breakdown is. They rendered it, and they've got these details. Where's the thing? Here you go. Here's your, excuse me, here's your normal map. Here's your ambient occlusion. Here's your other maps here. This is the red emissive, which got packed in the red channel. You got the roughness, which is in the green channel, and the metallic blue channel for this. And then the alpha channel is used for an opacity mask. Basically, they had another texture that was just, if you put these three things together, RGB, you'd get some smush, and then you would get whatever this is. I guess it's the alpha channel. So the point is that this is all done as a PBR workflow, but for a 2D thing. They basically just took a texture and put it in front of the camera, and that's how you get the lighting and the shadows across it. It is utterly bazonkers. If this works for your workflow, great. I just wanted to point this out because this is, in my opinion, superlative in a very clever use of this. So awesome. And you get that from this sort of process here. Okay. So something you can do. The catch is, though, that once you've gotten this made, you then have to use shaders inside of your game engine to take advantage of the PBR maps you've made. The other part of this is you need to have a lighting system to take advantage of this. This is not necessarily that obvious, but basically, if you don't have light, you're not going to use PBR. Because if you're using PBR, you're essentially saying, how does light interact with your object? That's the question that the physics in the physics-based rendering is. It's how does that light interact with the object? And if you don't have light, you don't have anything. So you can mix and match this with traditional pixel art assets as well. One thing that I love is this lacter. Again, I think I even misspelled it here. Oops, whatever. But basically, this is good at faking maps, particularly normal maps. So I have it open here. So here is a shrub. So, if a knight says, bring me a shrubbery, here you go. But basically, this is a thing that allows you to take this pixel art that I made, which is absolutely amazing. I just want to let you know, very amazing. And we're going to say, let's make a normal map with this. This is being automatically generated based on these knobs down here. I do want to pause. This actually, the UI is a bit borked for some reason. I'm not entirely clear why. This is free. So I'm not going to complain, but I will say that I can't zoom in on the UI, so I do apologize if this is hard to read. Ultimately, this is more supposed to be sort of a flavor of this particular program. So what I can do is I can change the height here, and that's going to change how drastically this thing considers its normal map to be. If I take it to 0, it's a flat, smooth, featureless nothing. And if I bring it up even a little bit, you can see I start getting the bumps. I can also set the center of this thing to have a certain amount of bump, which sort of overrides all the stuff in it. And if I drag this to the extreme, I essentially have like a cone here. So you can change this to be whatever you want, and it's doing so based on essentially what it's guessing from the colors in this. It has no idea of 3D space. I mean, look at the texture for this. There's nothing here. Yeah, I'm assuming that it's using something with like high pass filters, which is something where you can see essentially how different pixels are across from each other, and that gives you some kind of a value, and thus that gives you some kind of potential bump. But I'm not entirely sure how it does it. It seems kind of like black magic to me. You've got a specular map. Again, you can just sit here and you can play with your knobs and get different things. I think this is still set to normal. Whatever. Doesn't matter. Point is that play with this thing, see what you can get out of it. Free is a great cost. I suppose there's still time investment, but still. Excuse me. Itch.io does have a bunch of random pieces of software. This is something that I discovered. Essentially, you just log in, whatever. And I just did a search for pixel art, and then I picked tools. And you just got a whole bunch of random stuff on here. So these things may help you with your workflow. They may not, but certainly it's something that if you didn't even know it was there, there's nothing to be done. So go check it out, see if there's something on here. I don't, again, I don't work for anybody. I'm not being paid by anybody. So lastly, there are you like I said earlier that you could use a sort of live 3D to 2D sort of rendering with shaders. It is a bit technical to do this one, but it is something that many people do successfully. There are a lot of knobs that you need to turn in order to get this particular look, especially with animations. So like in Blender, let me go ahead and erase this. We're going to stay in Eevee. I'm going to give this a diffuse BSDF shader, and we'll plug that in there. So now we have this color here. What I can do, so I have a very soft gradient here, is I could say color ramp, and I can come in here, and instead of doing linear, I can set this to constant. And then what I can do is I can, let's see. Oh, I need to do the shader to RGB. Sorry, shader to RGB. And what this is going to do, this is essentially going to bake whatever that shader, those shader color values are. And so if I plug this in here, it'll look like it's shaded, but now I can do this little stunt, and then I can play with this a bit. And I need to go to, there it goes. Sorry, the shader needed to compile. It's saying it over here. So what you can see is that I have this sort of like film noir look, and I can change it here if I'd like. But, you know, I mean, I don't have to go with this. I could select this, and I could create. So I tell you what, let's get rid of that. Actually, let's keep this simple. What I can do is click on this, and I'll go into, I'll make this like a nice orange, and then I'll take this hex value, copy, and I'll paste this here. There we go. And then I can darken this. Actually, let me lighten this a bit more. And then over here, I can darken it. And then what I can do is I can actually add in some steps. So I can hit plus, and I can bring this up. And I can give myself a sort of 3D-ish look, right? Or sorry, pixel art look. So this is the kind of Sierra game look. And I can grab the light here, and I can move this around, and it'll update live, I think. Huh. Okay, so something has crashed in my shader engine here because something is not right. Whatever. Anyways, so the point is that normally this should be updating live. I don't know why it's not. Something's up. But the general idea you can see here is that you get this sort of look here where you essentially are, oh, I think I know what it is. I think it's because I took the diffuse out, and I could be using a principled BSDF. Is that it? Force it to recompile. Compiling shaders, one remaining. There we go. Yeah, I don't know why that's not updating live. Very strange. Whatever. Point is that it's possible, and this is how you would do it. You have to spend some time turning the knobs. Now, bear in mind, this is Blender, not a game engine. I'm just showing you this in principle. You'd have to do whatever the equivalent is of this color ramp in whatever game engine you're using. Okay, so that is basically it. At this point, I think it's probably a good idea to open up to questions. So if you've got some questions, I think we're going to move over to the general voice channel. So if you want to yell at me and say, Galdoc, you moron, you've done this, I'll say, my name is Derrick. I'm just kidding. But yeah, so I think we should move over there. Noah, I'll sort of ask you for guidance on this one.